So I figured I'd take a final look at Battlefront 2 and give you my thoughts on what it looks like in 2019. I've decided to approach this as both a re-review and also as a retrospective, and I've done this because I think it's important to understand the impact that the disastrous launch had on the game's evolution. I'm pretty sure the game we're playing in 2019 isn't the game DICE or EA had originally envisaged it would be. Battlefront 2's marketing, along with various senior people at DICE and EA, made various promises about what we should expect over its lifespan. A number of those promises never materialized, so I wanted to see how well the game has aligned with those original statements. I also want to discuss how different it is compared to the vanilla game, not just in terms of content, but what it's like to play Battlefront 2 in 2019. I'm also only going to focus on the online modes because very little has changed on the single player side of things since the story expansion in December of 2017. Now before I go any further, I just wanted to make it clear that I really like this game. I've sunk hundreds of hours into its various modes, and I've always felt that Battlefront 2's core gameplay is fun, but that's exactly why I'm so critical of it. I can see how it could be an amazing game if certain things were done differently. My hope is that by making a video like this, that maybe someone in the development team or someone who has some influence will see it and be able to do something about it. It's more than likely I'm just ranting into the ether, but either way, here goes. Now, to say that Battlefront 2 got off to a rocky start would be something of an understatement. Loot boxes, horrendously overpriced hero characters, and a fully shithouse pay-to-win progression system were chief amongst its problems. But to DICE's credit, most of these issues had been ironed out in the 6 months after launch. The first season of DLC that coincided with The Last Jedi was also a promising start to the live service the game had been positioned as. There have been plenty of other positive changes throughout its lifespan too, but it's certainly not been all smooth sailing. Many updates have consisted of little more than recycled content from the 2015 game, and the solo movie tie-in season strangely launched without any content that actually tied into the movie. But overall, the vast majority of changes have improved the experience. What's interesting though, that is over time, some of them, even the positive updates, have ultimately made the game worse in the long run. Battlefront 2's original objective, at least from a marketing standpoint, was to address the criticisms of the 2015 game. Arguably the biggest criticism of the original Battlefront was that the base game simply didn't have enough content. It had plenty of DLC, but most of that was premium content you had to pay for. So one of the biggest changes that Battlefront 2 made was the removal of paid DLC expansions. This was a pretty big deal. Paid DLC had been the industry standard for shipping post-launch content for a long time, and big games like Call of Duty still do it. Season passes had also seen widespread adoption ever since Rockstar popularized them back in 2011 with their Rockstar Pass for LA Noire. But by 2017, season passes had become increasingly unpopular, mainly due to the fact that their content was often vague, and in many situations they didn't contain all of the game's DLC. EA were undoubtedly keen to avoid the same criticisms about content again. They were also probably aware of how charging for things like maps and modes tends to split up the game's community, and this is bad for the long-term health of the game, particularly if you want to keep monetizing it. So the solution was to position the game as a live service and provide all of the game's DLC for free. The benefit of this for players would be new content that would keep the game feeling fresh and a bigger pool of people to play with. The advantage for the publisher would be the opportunity to bring in additional revenue over a long period using innocuous monetization strategies such as microtransactions. Done well, this is a viable strategy that keeps both players and publishers happy, but when it's mishandled, it generally ends up being a dumpster fire, and that's exactly what happened with Battlefront 2. On the surface, it might seem like this was an incredibly boneheaded move by EA. How on earth did they think they were going to get away with such an absurd pay-to-win progression system that favoured those with deep pockets? The truth is that they've been getting away with it for years in their FIFA games, and I'm sure internal discussions at EA sounded something along the lines of, "Hey guys, Ultimate Team is working a treat in FIFA, why don't we just do that in our other games?" As we all know, the backlash to Battlefront 2's monetization was swift, and it had large implications across the gaming industry. For the Battlefront development team, it meant some last-minute changes prior to launch, such as the removal of paid loot boxes, and some long-term changes like overhauling the progression system. While this seemed like a win for players, it obviously threw a spanner in the works for the planned post-launch support. It's clear that the way EA had planned to monetize the game throughout its lifespan was by enticing players to spend money on loot boxes that contained stat-based advantages. When this was no longer an option, it seemed like they didn't really have a backup plan, and this was evident by the fact that it took months before cosmetic items that could be purchased with real money were added into the game. Another problem with the post-launch content strategy was that it added lots of new modes. Now, new modes are normally an excellent way of extending a game's lifespan. They can make existing content feel fresh and often require less development resources than creating new assets like maps. There are a couple of problems with creating this type of content though. Firstly, you need to have a player base big enough to support multiple game modes. Otherwise, you simply fragment your players across all game types, making it more difficult to find games in general. If you look at some of the most popular online games right now, they typically only have a handful of modes. Apex Legends, for example, launched with just one. On top of keeping the player base together, less modes allows the development team to focus their efforts on changes that most players will see. This means that little development time is wasted on new content or updates that many people will never experience. To put things into perspective, Battlefront 2 has 10 online modes, with 3 large-scale options and 7 smaller ones. Both the large and small-scale modes have different maps, with plenty of the new locations being only available for the smaller game types. Because of this, there are quite a few new locations that don't get much, if any, use because there simply isn't anyone playing the smaller modes. The Kessel map and the Ewok Hunt mode are just 2 examples of decent post-launch content that I'm guessing that not a lot of people who've picked up the game in 2019 have been able to play. On top of there not being enough players to support all these new game modes, the game's UI doesn't do a great job of exposing everything. Unlike the 2015 game, which has a pretty simple and intuitive menu, Battlefront 2 buries almost all of its modes 3 levels deep. So while I think that many of these new modes and maps, even the recycled stuff, is pretty good, lots of it has ultimately ended up not being played very much outside of when it launched. Adding all this new content has also meant that many bugs and basic quality of life improvements have taken a back seat. Most of these issues have workarounds, which is probably why they haven't been addressed, but there are some genuinely game-breaking problems that need fixing pronto. Partying up with friends, for example, still seems to wreak havoc on the matchmaking, and I've encountered some bizarre control issues that can only be fixed by exiting your current game. Some of these issues have been with the game since launch, and I think that many long-time players would be happy to forego another new content update to simply have these annoyances fixed. Another area which hasn't seen much love is Starfighter Assault, which was once one of the most compelling modes. This is something I mentioned in my re-review, and unfortunately things haven't improved all that much. An additional mode was added along with a couple of new hero ships, but nothing substantial to keep it feeling fresh. Presumably, creating new content for this mode like maps is difficult because Criterion, who developed it, moved on to creating Firestorm for Battlefield 5 and clearly have their hands full. The new Hero Starfighter mode is fun, but it simply recycled existing content. When compared to the main Starfighter Assault mode, it lacks the same level of depth and is little more than a fun distraction. I can understand EA's logic in that it didn't really have any glaring issues, so why invest more development time into something that most people agreed was already good, but interest in this mode has clearly waned, and finding games in it has become much more difficult. In March of 2019, 2 new reinforcements were added, and I have to say that this type of content is something I wish DICE had focused more on. The new hero characters are nice and all, but it can be difficult to get a turn with them. Reinforcements have always been a good alternative because they cost less battle points and they mix up the gameplay. This is particularly true in the big modes where you often have a variety of vehicles and more powerful units to choose from. There have only been a handful of new reinforcements added to the game since launch, which definitely seems like a missed opportunity. There is an absolute ton of vehicles and units from the Star Wars universe that could be explored, and I think that having more options would be an easy way to keep the game interesting. One glaring omission in this area is the droidekas from the prequel films. Their inclusion has been requested since launch, and seeing as so much of the post-launch content has focused on the clone era, it definitely seems odd that they haven't been included. One of the key problems for players with the live service model is there isn't really a clear definition of what it should be. It seems like one studio's interpretation can be wildly different to another's. This definitely works in the publisher's favour because it's difficult to hold them accountable when there isn't a concrete list of expected features and modes. Just like with the 2015 game's Season Pass, there wasn't a huge amount of information given about what would be included in Battlefront 2's seasonal updates. The information we did receive about the post-launch support was vague at best, although there was mention of new weapons and live events. Now, it could be argued that new weapons were added with things like new heroes, reinforcement units, and ships, but the title New Weapons seems to indicate standalone weapons. As for the live events, well, without knowing the specifics of these, it's hard to know if we got them or not. Maybe that's what the movie tie-ins were supposed to be, but again, it sounded like these might be something else entirely. My guess is that this was planned content that got shelved when the progression system was overhauled. And to a certain degree, I can understand this. There are probably only so many resources to do everything. But it certainly hasn't done much for EA's credibility, nor has it done the live service model any favours from a trust point of view. So all this begs the question, what's next for the franchise? With Jedi Fallen Order due out in 2019, it seems extremely unlikely we'd see a Battlefront 3 the same year. The real question isn't, of course, when will we see a sequel, it's if we'll see one at all. Possibly by 2020, people will feel more open to the idea of a new Battlefront game, but that will depend on if Battlefront 2 has done enough to change people's minds. EA and DICE haven't managed to crack the live service model yet as far as I'm concerned. Battlefield 5 has fared slightly better, but it too has had many updates that felt like low-effort attempts to placate players until legitimately new content arrived. Given what we now know about the Frostbite engine being difficult to develop for, maybe the live service model just isn't a good fit for that platform. As for where the game should go from here, my suggestion to fix it right now would be to put Galactic Assault, Capital Supremacy, and a couple of the smaller modes on rotation in a playlist. For sure, some people might get the shits being forced to play modes they don't like, but it would keep the game from feeling stale. I also think that adding bots to pad out lobbies that don't fill after a certain amount of time would reduce waiting in lobbies. Both of these solutions aren't ideal, but being able to play in modes that aren't necessarily your favourite is better than not being able to play at all. I also think that Sony should follow Xbox's lead and give it away free for PlayStation Plus subscribers. It's not like the game is making huge dollars at retail, so why not try and boost the number of people playing it?
Aborting shutdown!
Battlefront 2 was supposed to correct the mistakes of the 2015 game, and while it mostly did, it unfortunately created brand new ones. To EA's credit, they have kept to their word and continued to support the game well after launch, but the quality of that support is a moot point. Look, if you picked up Battlefront 2 for cheap or for free, then yeah, there's still fun to be had with this game. But if you're jumping into the game for the first time, then just be aware that much of the additional content added post-launch will be unplayable. Finding a game of Galactic Assault on US servers is still pretty easy, but you might want to get used to playing on Kashyyyk. Overall though, despite all of my whinging, I think it remains a fun game, and even in 2019 it's still one of the prettiest titles on console. Anyway, if you've got any questions for me, jam them in the comments. If you liked the video, like it. If not, dislike it. If for some reason you want to see more of my videos, then subscribe. I only upload every couple of weeks, so hitting that notification bell is probably a smart move too. Anyway, thanks for watching.